It's rare, but every so often a book comes along with the power to change your life and the way you see the entire world. Andrew Willard Jones's latest book, The Church Against the State, is precisely this kind of book. It's available for pre-order now at newpolity.com/press. So often we Christians are cowards about our faith. We take its teachings as a sort of influence on the political order without daring to suggest that the church ought to be our political order. And I think that kind of cowardice, in which we're scared to express a positive vision of Christianity as a political form, that ends with this book. Andrew Willard Jones has a genius for expressing Catholic social teaching, not just as what we ought to do, but indeed as what we are already doing as happy, peaceful, and powerful people. His book takes both secular modern politics and Christian reactionary politics to task, and instead shows that the church has always had a better way for us, the way of subsidiarity, through which we are able to become a politically powerful people through love. I hope you'll pre-order this book today. What follows is my discussion with Dr. Andrew Willard Jones concerning his book and announcing its release. I hope you enjoy. Hello, everyone. Welcome to New Polity's podcast. I am so excited to announce that Dr. Andrew Willard Jones has written a new book, The Church Against the State, on subsidiarity and sovereignty. Pre-orders are available right now, and that's why we're sitting here, is to tell you to, in fact, pre-order the book. And we expect it to ship around January 25th.
Right.
That's the important information that I was told to say.
Yep.
The Church Against the State. So it seems to me, Andrew, that Andrew has been involved in controversies, and political theology controversies, such as they are.
Right.
And
they seem like a big deal to us. Turns out it's a very small deal.
And one of the things that you have, if I could really briefly sum up your 3-book career as it stands, is that in your book Before Church and State, you were looking at the High Middle Ages as a place that did not assume the terms of that dichotomy that we're so used to. You got the church, you got the state. Mm-hmm. Instead, you showed a world in which the church and the state, or what we would call the state, are operating as one body. And you use the term, they're about the common business of the peace and the faith. It was a sacred order of government, even as it was a governing order of the priesthood, of the spiritual power.
Exactly.
That's what the High Middle Ages were about. And so if we are going to then say, well, here's the church, here's the state in that time period, we're being anachronistic.
That's
we're reading back modernity's sort of willful and ideological division, saying these are two separate things, two separate forces that are in violent competition. We're reading that back into the Middle Ages. And like most things, seeing ourselves there as in a mirror.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Right.
And so because of this, you then wrote a history of the world, small order, little book.
Yep.
It actually is a shockingly small book.
Yeah.
2 cities. Mm-hmm. And you wrote this book, and I think it's fair to say, as a way of enacting what you'd found in the Middle Ages as a hermeneutic or a method of looking at history itself. So I almost think of it as an imaginary exercise. Like, what if we looked at world history as if there was not this arbitrary division between church and state?
I think that's fair, yeah.
And I think I think it's not just I say it's imaginary, but it also is true. It's like, well, you're looking back at times where they didn't have this modern invention of a strict dichotomy, even into ancient times where there was just not really this division between the sacred and the secular as we understand it now. And so it's not just an imaginary thing; it's actually more realistic historical method to look at the history of the world according to its own act, according to its own self-understanding, or what we can approximate of its self-understanding, and then express our modern time as a change, as a difference, as something that happened that's changed the kind of order.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's right. I think that part of the problem with all of these, Before Church and State, the Church Against the State, is that we're playing kind of linguistic games. I mean, part of the project is to redefine terms, or make what we think to be solid terms that we know the meaning of, to realize that we don't really, like the words actually mean different things than what we think they do. And so part of that, I think, is is showing that the state, the modern distinction between the church and the state, or the religious and the secular, is also sort of a ruse, or that itself is a word game, where there's an attempt at presenting the modernity as if it's not still a circumstance where the sacred and the profane are bound up together, the temporal and the spiritual are bound up together, to present it as if that is not so, even though it in fact is so. Yeah. So the modern state is itself just saturated with what we would call religious implications.
Sure.
Right? Religious facts, if we're going to keep the distinction. Actually, what you have to do is give it up.
Yeah.
You have to give it up and realize that the what you're really talking about is whether or not humanity is ordered towards its end or not.
Right.
And then the structural or social constructions that flow out of its relative order or disorder. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And those take sort of somewhat predictable forms.
Yeah. Yeah.
When
you then, on your third book here, which we're so happy to announce, take the title "The Church Against the State."
Yep.
It seems like an acceleration of some kind.
Yeah, totally.
From before church and state to no, you know what, just the church against the state. It was difficult. We were looking around for people to blurb this book, and people have been very gracious. Michael Hanby, Tracy Rowland, a couple others have read it and looked at it. We thought, it might be hard to get an ecclesiastic with the title, because I think, especially in America, the state, as part of this sort of word game, has become synonymous with government as such. So it's very hard to read something like the church against the state without imagining the state as a natural institution that just is a sort of outgrowth of man's political nature. Like, because man is like this, he makes states.
And that
so
kind
to
of
imagine
like
the opposition,
Aristotelian thing,
precisely, and to imagine this kind of opposition that you're saying, the church against the state, to be in that sense monstrous, impossible. How could the church oppose something that's
as if I'm about to propose some sort of anarchism?
So, what are you proposing here? That precisely the church being opposed to the state. If you could,
I think the beginning part is just to understand that the title's purposefully provocative, because what it wants us to do is ask the question, well, what do we mean by the state?
Yeah.
What is the state?
Yeah.
And that the state is not that timeless fact of humanity that we are socially organized, that we are hierarchically organized, that we are organized with power involved, that we are organized even with coercion being integral to our organization.
Yeah.
Right? The state is none of those things. The state is a particular form of the ordering of such things, right? Okay. And it's the form that emerges in the modern period with certain echoes or certain repetitions from the ancient world, right? I think that once we start to understand the state in the modern state as the drive, the project of constructing a closed world where the universal impulses within man towards truth, towards goodness, towards beauty do not transcend the world in which we build, but bottom out within it, right? So that's that concept of like sovereignty. There is a sovereign force on earth, and that the impulses within us, within our nature, to transcend the material and the material world in which we live, the temporal world in which we live, into the eternal, that which is our natural, which is our actual end, into the supernatural. That those impulses are like I said, are attempted to be usurped and redirected in a sort of inward, self-defeating cycle. Yeah,
so it's like you could say the church against the state, it seems, because you're arguing that the state is against the church.
Exactly. The state's actually built, I think, as a part of the project of dismantling the church.
Which would have been the natural place, as it were, for the universal impulse in man. Is that what you're saying?
The church.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, again, the terminology becomes problematic because in the Middle Ages, the church has to be understood as both the spiritual and the temporal power. So both the move into the universal which is always a move through particular instantiations, analogical instantiations. Like human beings are finite, the end is infinite, therefore our movement into the end is always a movement through analogical instantiations. But the very fact that those analogical instantiations are capable of being overcome and elevated ever closer into the transcendent end, towards that transcendent end, is the project of the spiritual power, the temporal power being the thing that is building those instantiations.
Yeah.
Right. So, and that they're always working together. Well, if you close it down, right, and you're saying no, that the temporal realm is all there is, and the spiritual now is no longer that which drives the temporal constructions past themselves, but becomes instead a sort of ruse, or a sort of strategy for convincing those who live with under any particular instantiation that it is the end itself. It's the total thing. There's nothing beyond it. It is it. That's sovereignty. That when you do that. So my point would be that the church itself was the combination of the spiritual and the temporal moving beyond themselves towards the transcendent. The division so it's not that the church was the spiritual power in the Middle Ages. The church was both. Right. The construction of the modern state is the attempt to not to divorce them, but to subordinate the spiritual to the temporal, right? Which renders neither of them the spiritual or the temporal.
Right.
So once the temporal power of the church is subordinated, or is viewed as superior to and final over the spiritual power, it's no longer the temporal power of the church.
Right.
And the spiritual power, quite frankly, is no longer the spiritual power. Right. It becomes modern religion, privatized religion, which operates within the state.
Gotcha.
Right. And so now we have neither church nor state, or nor the spiritual or the temporal power.
Right.
The construction of the state is the destruction of the church.
Right. And you think this was a historical, ideological project of particular people. I mean, this is one thing that when I first was reading you, I didn't understand. I thought it was like, these are ideas, and then the idea of Christendom with the temporal and spiritual power as the one church gave way to the idea of the church and the state and modernity, in the way that you described.
Yeah.
But it seems to me in this book, especially, that it's not just ideas passing over to others. It's like a deliberate program in some ways of a liberal elite to take the power and property of the church through this ruse, so that the ruse is... I think that is definitely there, and definitely real. I'm hesitant to give ideas priority because I think that often the desire for power, say, the desire for domination, the desire for wealth, it's not always the case that those desires are flowing out of some program. It's often the case that we're backfilling our rationality to justify the desire. So if it is the case that I desire unmitigated power, and if I want to convince myself that that's right, that I should, that it's not wrong for me to desire unmitigated power, then what must be true? Oh, well, then Hobbes, then I must be, Hobbes must be right. Yeah. Right. And so now you're constructing the argument. Now, so I think that they're in the intellectual component and the kind of volitional and even spiritual component of sin, pride, envy, greed, that those things are always bound up together and in relationship to each other. Yeah. But I'm not quite sure, and I think they even trade off on who's kind of driving the ship at different times. Sure.
You know. But I do think that in the early modern period, it was recognized by many that the traditional Catholic understanding of humanity and human social order was incompatible with the project that was underway, and that it needed to be destroyed. And that's very clear. Yeah.
all this and more in Andrew Willard Jones's new book, The Church Against the State. Its subtitle here is On Subsidiarity and Sovereignty. And in this very brief presentation of the book, you've given us a sort of one-sentence idea of sovereignty, namely a closed temporal order that has subjected the spiritual order to itself, or even more short, a world in which this world is all there is.
Yep.
And you're not guided by transcendence, because you have this human replacement of it almost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think quite literally. I mean, sovereignty, the word itself comes into use in reference to God.
Yeah.
In the late Middle Ages.
Yeah.
And its transfer to the king is a direct replacement of the divine.
And that's a modern move. I mean, this is I don't think people necessarily understand, and they presume that the language of absolutism, because it's when they're most familiar, especially in America, of kings. Speaking about themselves, is the absolutist period, and they presume that that's what they overcame within liberal periods. It's like, well, we used to have kings who thought they were gods, and that was the religious thing. That was a religious thing, and then we rejected it with the secular thing. And if you want to have a little bit of religion, you can have it in the secular thing, but you better not do that king thing they did.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. Right. So that is to presuppose sovereignty as the given.
Yeah.
Right. Or there's always someone who is sovereign. There is always a sovereign power. There's all that is a very easy, and I think philosophically very mistaken conception. I mean, it's the kind of mistakes that Carl Schmitt makes, that Hobbes makes, that a lot of the fans of Carl Schmitt and Hobbes makes to this day make. Right. And it's alluring somewhat because it's so simplistic and like sort of reductionist and actually kind of unsophisticated.
Yeah.
Right. So to just say there's always the strongest man in the room.
Yeah.
It's like, well, of course, man. I mean, that's not really like, I don't know. That's not really very insightful. The real insight would be, well, how does this power work? Right. How does if there's the strongest guy in the room, great. Why do people do what he says? When he speaks, his strength can't be that he can beat people up, because if I can get two guys, I can beat him up. Mm-hmm. Right. And so that's not it. If there is a strongest man, how? And it's like, and then when you get into that, then you start to say, well, he must be speaking somehow into a matrix of truth or of meaning that is shared with others. And therefore his speech is efficacious because people respond to his speech, right? And then you're like, well, that must be. It could be. We could say, okay, so there's space in there for lying. That could be kind of a tyrannical move within there, but only to what extent? If it's all a ruse and it's a lie from top to bottom, how long does that work? At some point, doesn't that break down because people no longer believe him, and then the power becomes unefficacious instead of efficacious? And then you're like, well, okay, so if real power then is always somehow a relationship between the ruler and the ruled, then we're talking about some context in which that power exists. What is that context? Right? And I think that's when we philosophically, and I try to in the book spend a lot of time discussing that, then you get into an understanding of there being worlds, social worlds that are constructed through discourse, and ultimately through friendships. And those social worlds have a coherence within them, and power can work efficaciously within those worlds, which diffuses that power then. Now we have to understand that power to not be something that's possessed by any one entity, but that their possession of power is in fact a participation in some power structure or some world in which power subsists. And now when you start delving into that, not only are you pulling the rug out from underneath of sovereignty as a theory in the modern period, because if it's true, it must be true in the modern period too. The states must not be what they purport to be.
Gotcha.
But then also you move in the other direction and say, but what about in a just society? If we're going to propose the possibility of a true society that's aimed to the transcendent end of man, and this is true about how power works, the social reality of how power works, what is the form that takes? And that is where we get to the idea of subsidiarity. So the idea of hierarchies of parts to a whole which are in themselves wholes.
Yeah.
Right, that they're not parts in the sense of components to some machine, right, but are rather themselves wholes that are in analogical relationship within a hierarchy. And that's very complicated, but it's really the sort of positive thrust of the work, is describing what that is, subsidiarity.
Yeah, I think the subtitle could have been, though it would have been repetitious, subsidiarity against sovereignty.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
There's these two ideas at play. In a way, you don't really write new things. I've noticed you write
the same thing
over and over again.
Thanks,
but Mark. You must buy this book.
Really nice. so
no, but it's
man.
No, there's two types of thinkers, right? What do they call them? What is it?
Foxes and hedgehogs.
Foxes and hedgehogs. That's right. And the hedgehog knows one thing, right?
Yeah.
And this work is a collection of many essays, but all brought up into a new argument. So they've all been edited for the sake of this particular book.
Yeah, and integrated into each other.
And these essays are all born out of various conflicts. So it's. I mean, I think this is how most things work. Really, is that you are drawn into argument, and then the argument produces a further development of a thought.
Certainly the way it works with me. I need the, it's the friend enemy thing. I got to have the guy I'm after.
Which is one way of loving your enemy.
Yeah, exactly.
There's a lot here that I think what's been most wonderful is that drawing out of the just society, not as some kind of utopian future, where, okay, if we play all our cards right, then Christians will eventually instantiate their one true political philosophy, which has been described here. Mm-hmm. It's not that. It's actually a constant reminding of where we are already living out this truth. We're already living out the truth of subsidiarity, where we already are in relationships where we are acknowledging that power is efficacious because of love and friendship.
Right.
And that this isn't like... And the lie of liberalism, and so the lie of the state, of the what you might call the naturalized state, or the replacement of the idea of government with this thing called the state. This in your work, it comes into view as this constant suppression of what we know to be true in other areas. So it's like, well, in your family, for instance, that competition among members doesn't produce power in the family. Like a family that's fighting itself is a weak family.
Right.
And then the work of the liberal project seems to be, but what you know to be true is... It's
not really true.
It's not really true.
Look, competition makes us big and strong.
Exactly. So you have this constant denial on the one hand, and I guess the reason I think it's important is because you're describing a actual suppression of the church. Like when you describe the state, people can just input almost when you say that a active suppression of the church, and that this isn't it isn't simply one grand thing like these people suppressed the church and now we have states. It's a constant.
It has to be, because it's a war against who we are.
Yeah.
And which means it's a war that is never ending, because human beings want to be human beings and we want to be happy, which means we're constantly constructing new forms of subsidiarity. We're constantly building places where we can find friendship and happiness. And so the war against that becomes a perpetual struggle. And therefore the progress of modernity is this ever ramping up conflict, right? Yeah. As humanity attempts to defend itself.
Right. Yeah. And that comes up through the book. There's the one essay that I think kind of sticks out, especially if you're looking at the table of contents, which we're going to make available for everyone in the pre-order, is an essay about socialism and capitalism. So it's because I think it'll stick out because it's in some ways, I think, precisely a symptom of statist thinking that imagines the economic order to be something separate from at once the political order and then definitely the spiritual order. And so in your work here, you're describing both as socialism and capitalism as belonging to the whole, belonging to the regime of power in that sense. And your argument, if I recall, is that capitalism produces socialism. Like any critique of socialism is ultimately also a critique of capitalism.
That's right.
For that.
They're bound up together as two sides. And this is something many other people have said. Although I think hopefully maybe I add something to it with the discussion of subsidiarity.
Yeah.
Right. That there's really that whole sort of pretend absolute dichotomy between individualism and collectivism. Yeah. That in fact what we actually find historically is that a prerequisite for collectivism is individualism.
And how do you see individualism?
Society must be atomized as much as possible in order for collectivism to emerge.
And do you see that individualism as a result of us living in states, or imagining ourselves as simply living in states?
Yes. I mean, I think that goes back to the whole idea of that ultimately both capitalism and socialism and those movements are about sovereignty, because the individual, what the state has a problem. Its sovereignty isn't realized wherever there's relationship, right? Wherever there's relationship between people, then there's a world that emerges that is the context for that relationship. That is a world that's not controlled by the sovereign. Right, and therefore there's power that's not controlled by the sovereign, right? And so there's a actual society that's not a result of the sovereign power. So the war against relationship is the at root project of the creation of the sovereign, right? So this means that the atomization of the population, as much as possible, to the extent possible, is prerequisite to any sort of to the extent to which you can atomize the population is the extent to which sovereignty can be realized.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, sovereignty is a form of power that's only really believable to the degree that we also believe that we are individuals.
Exactly. And this is very clear. I mean, this is not just a sort of philosophical extrapolation from this premise. This is in the theories. I mean, like in the theory of divine right, monarchy and absolute monarchy is individualist anthropology. Gotcha. Right? The guys who are arguing for it have the same anthropology as John Locke.
And certainly in the theory of capitalism that you see in like the Austrian
obviously
economists,
radical individualism.
But then with socialism, how do you see that as assuming the same? I mean, because most people, I think, on the face of it would say, but there's a different anthropology operating in socialism, right?
Not really. It's just more complex.
Sure.
So I think that the individual as the alienated individual, the individual who's suffering under the powers of the world, right? And that he is somehow bound by his social construction, the consciousness of his class, the material reality, all of those sorts of things are still positing that the ideal is this emergence of the sovereign individual in the end, who's free, like Karl Marx would say, what does he say, to like be a shepherd in the morning and a poet in the evening and a critic, right? Like that it's still the case that is the ultimate understanding of the human person.
So right? the socialist is just the individualist who's sad.
Well, it has a more of an insight into the social, the way in which it's not just the formal structures of society, but the informal, the material structures of society that are in which power subsists, right? Whereas the liberal is deluding himself into thinking it's all positive law and whatever rights and all that kind of formal stuff. So I think the socialist, that's why the socialism comes after, right? It's a more sophisticated social theory, but it nevertheless a far more sophisticated social theory than liberalism, which is just silly. But it is ultimately within the same game.
Yeah. Heck of a book, Andrew.
Thank you.
Yep. All this and more in The Church Against the State on Subsidiarity and Sovereignty by Andrew Willard Jones. Again, pre-orders are available right now. And if you can do a pre-order, then it's going to be $29.95. If you want to buy your book, that's how much you're worth. It's going to go up probably to $39.95 for actual orders. So get in early. Well done. I know books are hard work, especially the indexing of them.
Oh, man, brutal. Worst part about it.
But we are very excited, not just for the book itself, which is, you've probably got maybe 2 more books in you after this before you
Ooh,
die. I mean, that's your
stretch.
rate. That's your rate.
Maybe. Yeah.
We won't talk about your age here in this public forum, but
that's fine. I'm hoping to get at least 2.
So,
maybe 1.
So we're glad to pick these up for their own sake. And I really do think there is a way forward for Christians who want to live in a Christian world.
Yeah.
I think this stuff is essential because it is taking away not just the things we know need to be taken away, that our sins and vices, but also taking away our habitual modes of thinking about the world that don't allow the freedom and possibility of the Christian vision we don't have the power to enact it because we simply can't see it as possible.
Right,
when
exactly.
we always think, well, there's this thing that's not really about God or religion, and I call it the state, and all of my longings sort of stop there. Well, then we are living in a certain world, and to be able to unthink it is not just a airy exercise in philosophy. It's also opens up radical new possibilities. Like, well, if I don't have to think that the sacred stops where the state begins, if I don't have to think that what is true in the family and true in the church sort of hangs its hat once it walks into what's true of government and true of power and true of
you don't have to think that the private is some world that doesn't have anything to do with power.
Right.
For example.
Right. Yeah. That is it's valuable, and it's what's going to be necessary, I think, for any actual building of Christian community, which is a big goal around these here parts. But this is all to say, it's not just about what's great in the book. We're also very excited to be finally expanding New Polity Press. We have been only sort of a press in hope. I don't think a press can only have one book. That's just called publishing a book. You got to have at least a multiplicity to be.
You have to have
press.
a catalog. Right?
Yeah. So now,
so does 2 make a catalog?
It does.
Maybe 3.
I think if you have a consumer choice, then you're looking at a catalog.
Okay.
And so with Andrew's book, we also, for the first time, give the consumers of New Polity Press a consumer choice, and I think that's important too. Awesome. So please buy the book, pre-order it now, and we'll be speaking a lot more about it as it has its effect on us here at New Polity and also the wider reading world. So, Andrew, well done. Thanks again.
Thank you, Mark.
We'll see you all next time. Goodbye.
Bye.